This is the first episode of What is the State of Art?
Nice.
And I guess the purpose is I just want to explore what artists, like, their projects are, and specifically since you are here, can you introduce yourself and kind of tell the audience, like, what you're doing?
Awesome. Okay, so my name is Pierce Delahunt. I'm a current grad student with the Institute for Humane Education. I'm a staff person with the Youth Empowered Action Yay Camp, which is an activist education summer camp for young activists who want to learn how to better their skills. And I'm a constituent volunteer with Resource Generation on their National Campaign Committee, working with them to help organize people with privilege, especially wealth and class privilege, but any kind of privilege, to leverage it on behalf of those without that privilege.
But what are you about to do? Like, you're
Totally
like packing up and ready to go on tour, right?
Yeah, so I've moved into a pickup truck. So I live out of my Ford F-350, 2000 turbo diesel power, whatever, 7.3 liter engine. That'll mean something to the pickup truck folk. And I moved into that, and I'll be driving that across the country, especially the South, in order to get here in Berkeley, where I've learned that I most enjoy myself in the community, the environment. It's really nice here. So the plan is to drive across and do a tour of activism. There's a couple different components to that. One is something I call micro demonstrations, where I sit outside of a place and invite people to have conversations with me that critique that place. The idea there is that I value protests, but I don't feel useful at them. My skill set and passion is about conversing with people and finding common ground and finding understanding and getting that dialogue going. So the micro demonstration is just me outside of these places and inviting people to talk. So I prototyped this by sitting outside of McDonald's in Union Square in New York City, and I had a table and folding chairs and a sign that said, "Ask me why I no longer eat here." And I invited people to have that conversation if they wanted to. So I wasn't imposing the conversation on anyone. They come up to me, and then when they do, I ask them what's important to them, and I show them a spinner that says animal rights, human rights, environmental rights, personal and public health. And they can choose one if they want, and if they don't know what they want, then they can spin it, and I talk about that. There's a couple different ways and reasonings for that, but I like the idea that they come up to me and then I talk about what's important to them.
Well, wait, why, like, right now specifically are you targeting going to the South?
Sure. So there's a couple different aspects for that, but one of them is that a lot of this is about increasing dialogue across partisan lines, and I'm showing up as my liberal-ass self, because that's who I am. And so if I want conversation that crosses these partisan lines, then I've got to find people who are willing to show up as their conservative-ass selves. And so I'm inviting all those folk to come and talk with me. And so the idea then is that the place where that is abundant is the South. And also it's warmer there, and it's nice, and I'll be traveling during the fall. And it's a part of the country that I think, because a lot of this is coming from my perspective as a liberal New Yorker, where I know stuff that's happening in New York, and I know stuff that's happening in California. I hear a little bit about what's happening in Chicago, but the most that I tend to hear about the South as a liberal New Yorker is about how screwed up it is, and the how backwards the politics is. But I want to find common ground. I want to find connection even with people I disagree with. That's something I put a lot of effort into, is combining social emotional learning with activism in a way that serves both.
So when you go where specifically you're going to go in the South, like, where are you going to set up shop and kind of invite people to talk with you?
Totally. I'm looking especially for places where I have connections via friends, so I'll just be stopping by to see them, and that'll be nice. Feed two birds with one hand. And then I'm also looking for places that have particular either organizations, community-led organizations, because that's the other part of this, is that I'm interviewing community-led organizations about the work they're already doing. I want to highlight and soundboard their voices and perspectives. And so I'll be looking for those, as well as places where that I might not have friends or might not have community-led organizations, but are prime spots for this kind of work, whatever that means. Certainly, there are cities that I think I would love to see from that standpoint of finding people where most of them disagree with me about a number of socio-political issues.
How are you going to attract people to you? I mean, are you going to just like sit outside more McDonald's, or are you going to just like sit outside churches? Are you going to have like a huge sign? Like, how are you going to attract people to you to start talking about this stuff?
I'll definitely sit outside more in McDonald's. It won't be limited to that, but definitely McDonald's is on the list. Other fast food restaurants are certainly there, but also I want to sit outside of ExxonMobil. Signs has asked me why I no longer purchase gas here and or invest here. Churches are not necessarily on my radar, but something like the Westboro Baptist Church I might do this for, and have that conversation. Although I would love to be engaging with specifically those folk too, because the people working at McDonald's I am open to talking to, but they're not necessarily the decision makers who disagree with me. That would be a different conversation. Whereas the people at Westboro Baptist Church, I would very much like to engage because they are so oppositional to the views that I have. But yeah, I would love to do something like that for sure.
So, I mean, can you kind of run through how people approach you and what you have set up around you when this starts happening?
Sure. So with the prototyped example, I was sitting outside McDonald's and I brought a book because I didn't know if people would come talk to me right away or if there'd be long lags of time between. And I make it clear that I don't need you to come to me. This is a no pressure situation kind of thing. So I think that the book helps symbolize that, but that you're still welcome to. So eventually people were coming up to me. Sometimes it was a person who was thinking about going vegan and had not gotten themselves to take that plunge yet. Sometimes it was people who had just come out of McDonald's and were curious why it might be that they wouldn't want to work there or patronize McDonald's. And sometimes there was one person I was talking to having a heart-to-heart. Sometimes it was 5 people I was talking to at once who were throwing questions at me. Sometimes there'd be people just wanting to listen to whatever conversation was already happening. I did get one person. There were 3 people from McDonald's who saw me, and one of those people came up, and she actually asked me, she said, "I have a question for you." And I said, "Yes, please." And she said, "Why do you no longer eat here?" And I asked her, which subject on the spinner she wanted to talk about. And she chose human rights. That was by far the most commonly chosen one, I think, because most people know the animal rights reasons of not eating at McDonald's and even the environmental, personal, and public health. But most people are not as familiar with the human rights reasons. And so I knew already what I was going to say if someone from McDonald's approached me, is that, well, the first thing I said, the first thing that I'll say is the one you're most familiar with, is that they haven't gotten on board with the $15 minimum wage yet. And she gave me a solemn nod. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that one. And then I went on about issues of human rights in the animal agriculture sector, which is often less discussed than the human rights issues in plant-based agriculture, but both are horrible and deserve a lot more attention. And then talking about things like government corruption or corporate corruption of corporate lobbying with the government, and with the animal agriculture sector, that's huge. There's a huge lobbying arm of the animal agriculture business. So certainly those issues, as well as places like McDonald's and other big-time fast food industries killing small family farms and those communities.
Mm.
So that was the bulk of it.
Are you, since this, we're right in the middle of a presidential race, are you going to be addressing that at all, or?
Sure, yeah. So I'll definitely be addressing the presidential race, and obviously I'm again showing up as my whole liberal self. So that's what I'm bringing. But more than trying to convince anyone of my liberal ideology is I want to have that conversation in that community and that understanding, even with people who disagree. So even if you disagree with my views, what I really want is for you to care. And that, more than anything, is what I see this campaign as, rather than a recruitment technique or something like that, or at least not a recruitment technique into my personal views or activism. I want to recruit people into the concept of caring and the concept of advocacy, and taking a stand for whatever your beliefs are. Because I think the more that we get those conversations and the more care we get people to have, the better world we can live in. I don't see any downside to trying to get people to care more. So that is what I'm going for more than anything else, I think.
How do you sort of address that? Like, how do you make people care?
Yeah. I think that I wouldn't necessarily phrase it in the way of making people care, but in terms of inspiring that, I would talk to them about what is already important to them. What do they already care about? And then talk about how these things affect that. One of the things I'm also going to be trying to bring about with this is an intersectional focus, in that whatever you care about, because we all care about something, all of these issues are going to affect that. That's just how intersectionality works, where everything is connected, especially issues of oppression and freedom and justice and liberty and all those things. So with the idea of intersectionality and birdcage theory, where there's no one bar that is imprisoning the bird, that they all work together to cage the bird. The idea is that we can talk about any one of these things, and so whatever is most important for you, then that's what I'm going to talk about, because I want to talk about what's most relevant to you. I'll mention how that's important to other things, because I want people to be aware of that, but I'll absolutely keep the focus on what is most important to the person in front of me at the time.
So how did you first come to realize that this is sort of the medium that you're going to focus this in, but mainly the idea of advocacy in general? How did you realize that was what you're going to be
totally
fighting for?
There's a couple different versions of that story that I can tell depending on how much length we have. But I just always remember, ever since I was very little, having a strong sense of fairness, of wanting that, and being really committed to that. And I think that I personally always felt very oppressed by authority in general, but especially by school, because that was one of the greater authorities that I was ever facing when I was young. And so I went to a number of schools, 2 different high schools, and a number of schools before that. And the one school I ever truly loved changed my whole life around and got me thinking about why it was that school inspired such a love of the institution and the place and what they were about, and all the other schools before that failed. And one of the reasons that I came upon was social emotional learning. So the school that I love, St. Anne's in Brooklyn, where I graduated from, they don't explicitly have courses in social emotional learning. They don't explicitly teach that, or at least they didn't when I was there. Maybe they do now. But I think that they definitely apply those lessons in a sincere and genuine way in respecting the creative autonomy of their students. And that was something that I really felt when I was there.
So, how would you describe what social emotional learning is?
Yeah. So social emotional learning is a broad umbrella term. It's just basically like saying science or history, but it's any learning material, any educational content that is relevant to dealing with relationships and or feelings. And that means relationships with oneself and understanding those as well as with others. And it can be as concrete and specific as reading body language cues, or as more abstract as the differences between guilt and shame and embarrassment, and understanding how they operate within you and what to do about that. But there's a lot of different approaches and perspectives on it. But that's the umbrella term, is social emotional learning.
So did you feel like that was missing in other institutions, and like
big time?
In what ways were people just blind to the fact that this existed? And
I wouldn't say that so much as its value was downplayed. When you require students to learn how to integrate and differentiate calculus terms and clauses, but you don't ask them to think about what do they do when they're angry, that communicates a strong message about what is important, and that is not just communicated to the student. That's communicated to the teachers as well as everyone in the school, as well as everyone in the community and society. And so that is expected to be something that we just figure out on our own. But that leaves a strong lack of institutional support, where, like, if I have any trouble figuring out how to deal with that on my own, there's nowhere for me to turn there other than, the internet, which has a lot of great information on it and also a lot of not great information. So the idea that we would support people in something that is not directly relevant to their lives, but not in what is directly relevant to their lives, that was one of the things that I felt very strongly when I was growing up, and that to me was a message of oppression. It was saying your life and your values and literally the way you move through the world is less important than this formula. And not to be harping on calculus, because I actually really like calculus, but any subject really. But the idea that those things are considered important is what society tells us is important and to study. And then moving from that, I got very much into social emotional learning, and was always dedicated to a strong sense of fairness, and went vegan, and it was actually by going vegan, I credit going vegan a lot to my eventual understanding of systems oppression and intersectionality, because when I went vegan, that system of animal oppression was much easier to see as a white male than sexism or racism. I was believed in the concepts of sexism and racism, but the moving through the world as a vegan, I saw things like advertisements that dehumanized or depersonified animals to a degree that I was uncomfortable with, and I was confronted with that more all the time and in every facet. So I saw systems oppression more. So I understood that in a much better way, and then I was able to apply those lessons to things like sexism and racism, which I don't experience on a personal level every day. I don't even experience speciesism myself on a personal level every day. But then once I had that understanding, I also applied those same concepts from social emotional learning to that, where if we have a school filled with students that live in a community where there is a polluting factory that is giving them asthma, and the question they have is, how do we organize to get this factory out of our town? And the school tells them, that's not what's important to your life. What is important to your life is learning how to integrate differentials. Then we're telling them, you need to continue being oppressed, that this tool is more important than the tool that is literally more immediate to your own physical health. And that is something that I see as highly problematic.
Where you first got frustrated with how to express your anger, and how that's not really taught, and how does that affect people not knowing how to express that?
Totally.
I mean, do you think there's value in violence or not? Or
yeah. All right. These are juicy questions. I love personally the phrase "Don't get mad, get organized," which is not to say suppress your anger, but rather the concept that we find constructive outlets for our anger. One of those being organizing against whatever is oppressing us. Plenty of creative outlets too. I'm a firm believer in acknowledging and feeling our feelings, and that can be done constructively. For me personally, I don't believe in violence, where I would define violence as certainly self-defense would not be included in that. Something more along the lines of physical harm for the sake of punishment, or for the sake of the sake of the harm itself, whatever we get out of that.
But what do you mean, don't get violent, organized, or don't get angry for? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So that I see this sometimes with our campers, where they have anger about the world, but they don't necessarily know how to channel that towards the oppressive systems. So sometimes we get campers who lash out at us because they've been taught, essentially, they've learned that all authority is bad. And that was something I had growing up. I just thought all authority was bad, because every confrontation I had with authority was an instance where something I didn't trust was happening, or I was being punished in some way or scolded. But the idea of channeling the anger to challenge the oppressive systems rather than the systems that are designed to support us, being one of the ways that we can self-sustain. Talking about sustainability, I'm a firm believer in thinking what applies to the macro systems applies to the micro systems. We need to find ways that we can sustain ourselves. Self-care is activism too, in this world that demands so much of us, where activist burnout is a huge issue, and compassion fatigue, especially among rescue animal caregivers.
But how do you? So you work with kids, and you teach them how to organize and be political activists.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody comes up to you, and they have this anger towards whatever cause. And how do you explain to them how to, organize a group and to do this?
Totally. So that's going to depend on a number of factors, right? So there's their own skill sets. Are they the kind of person who likes to channel their emotions through art? Is arts activism something for them? Or are they networkers? Are they people who are good at outreach and can mobilize people in that way? Or are they fundraisers? Or do they do computer programming, and can they construct a website that can have educational content or something along those lines? So all of those are questions. And then there are questions about what their resources are. Do they live in a community that supports them in the larger sense, or is the community they live in part of the reason they're angry? We get that a lot at our camp. Is a lot of the campers are the only ones there who care about anything, or at least they think that. And oftentimes we encourage them to seek out others who maybe also have these same feelings but have not expressed them. But that concept of what are your resources, right? Because if you are if your family is connected to a political system or a business of some kind, then maybe that will mean the way you organize is going to be different than if you have none of those connections. Or if you have connections to people who are amazing at art but don't necessarily know about these issues, that's going to influence the way that you organize around these systems. So all of those are questions too. So we actually work with the campers to work on the causes of their choosing. We call them issues of importance, IOIs. The causes of their choosing, and then come up with an action plan working with them and a mentor who's familiar with the issue or method of advocacy. And in that way, it's more tailor aligned, because all of these things have to be individualized. There's no pre-packaged kit to how to do activism, or I would argue anything, but yeah.
I mean, do you think that people are intentionally depoliticized, especially as youth? I mean, do you think that's the case, and how do you get people to even care?
Sure. I think that there is certainly some intentionality behind it, yes. But I would focus on the unintentional ways that we depoliticize people in general, and youth especially, simply because those are ways that are easier to change. If there's someone working to intentionally depoliticize anyone, that's just going to be harder to fight against. But in ways that we can focus on the unintentional ways that we perpetuate oppressive systems, that's simply and mostly an issue of bringing about more awareness and having those conversations. And part of that is what this tour is about, is bringing more awareness and having these conversations, just getting people to think about these things. So even if you love McDonald's, you're still more aware, hopefully, about how your dollars influence systems and promote concepts, and how the concept of voting with our dollar is a big part of that aspect of what I'm doing, is more consumer awareness.
I mean, like, why do you feel it's important to be politically active in the first place?
Sure. I think the short answer is that it affects us. It affects us in large ways and in small ways, and all those things matter. And even if you think it's not affecting you, and let's just say it's not, it's affecting other people that you know or care about, and that affects you. And to dismiss that, I think, is basically to give up your power. And we could do that, but then when we give up our power, the people who are willing to take it are not necessarily the most fair and looking out for our interests. And I would argue that that is something that we need to stop, that we need to take our power back so that we can increase the equity and fairness in the world and stop injustice.
So, do you think that's sort of one of the main reasons of becoming political, to stop the flow of money to a certain class of people, or? Sure.
I would say the flow of power, money being one manifestation of that power, but certainly, yes, is the politics. I actually was just reading on a website that I don't agree with, but one of the statements they had that I liked was politics is the distribution of power. And to not be interested in that is to say, you can have mine, because that is simply what's going to happen if you don't take an interest. There are too many people willing to take your power if you're not going to protect it. And personally, voting is just one way that we can express our power. But personally, I think that is what happens when we don't vote. Is we say, no, you can decide. I'm good. I don't need this. And I'm not interested in shaming anyone for not voting. Certainly, I totally understand the concept of being jaded with our system and cynical about it. At the same time, the worst, if you truly are cynical about all of that, then the worst that I think voting can be is a waste of time. And I think that is I'm not much of a gambling person, but if the biggest hit that I'll take is a waste of time, and the biggest win that I'll take is a knowledge that I collectively participated in something to distribute power the way I think is equitable, then I'll take that bet any day.
So with the tour, what are you going to call your tour that you're going to be doing this on? Like what?
Yeah, I've called it a couple things. I started it out as the Ask Me Why tour. The question in front of McDonald's being "Ask me why I no longer eat here," and intending to use that format of the question throughout. I've since started calling it the Great American Road Trip and a tour of activism, a tour of conversations. So that is open to discussion. I don't have anything firmly solid at this moment, but it might just have a couple different names as I go.